The U.S. isn't planning to use American troops for hostage rescue operations, while at the same time authorities are on high alert for signs of terrorism. Check it out, guys.
And amid this war and all of this uncertainty, back in the U.S. tonight, security is now being stepped up. Tonight, ABC News confirming that every major city police department in the country is now on heightened alert amid concerns of threats against synagogues and houses of worship and some schools. Here's our senior investigative reporter, Aaron Katursky, on the concerns and what authorities are now doing tonight.
Tonight, police across the country are on high alert after online calls for a global day of action tomorrow.
No justice, no peace.
There have been peaceful demonstrations nationwide since that horrific Hamas attack, and federal officials say they know of no specific plans for violence in the United States. But Attorney General Merrick Garland telling President Biden today they're watching for any sign of a terror threat here at home. In New York, the NYPD is calling in extra personnel and telling officers to be prepared to work 12-hour shifts.
We're trying to make sure that violence doesn't manifest on the streets of New York City.
Honestly, guys, I'm worried about the American people. I'm worried about those American hostages in Palestine that they're forgetting about. Or is it turning their back on? Now, I haven't confirmed this, but I heard from somebody that Biden said for Americans trapped in Israel to sign promissory notes to repay all travel costs if they decide to be rescued by the U.S. government. Have you guys heard this? Can anybody confirm that for me? Because if it is true, this is definitely something to be alarmed about. What I have personally dug up is a White House national security advisor saying that the U.S. is not contemplating putting American troops on the ground to assist with any kind of hostage rescue efforts following the terrorist attacks in Israel. This is according to John Feiner, President Biden's deputy national security advisor. He also said that the efforts to recover Americans who were taken hostage by Hamas following the terrorist attacks, they're going to be difficult, in part logistically because of the environment in Gaza. Basically, they're saying it's an intelligence challenge. How do you actually find these people? And then once you do find them, like if you do find them, how do you actually locate them and extract them ultimately? Like either negotiate their release or try operationally to remove them? See, Gaza is notoriously dense with a whole network of tunnels, and officials believe that the hostages, whether American or Israeli, would be spread out and likely not all held together in like one cluster. They'd likely be housed in separate underground areas with innocent civilians in an effort to make a rescue operation even that much more difficult. Not to mention, U.S. officials believe that the quality of Israeli intelligence in the area has slipped. I mean, they missed the whole Hamas sneak attack. And that's just one. There's been an overall lack of reliable information from that whole area. Further complicating the situation is that Hamas consists of a whole lot of competing subgroups and militias that all operate in Gaza. Before the U.S. can even put together a plan to rescue hostages, officials have to first figure out which of those Hamas subgroups may be holding them. And so for now, the U.S. is deferring to the Israeli special forces who have far greater experience in Gaza. A team of American military specialists have arrived in the region and is consulting with their Israeli counterparts about possible plans of action. Now, among other elements, U.S. Central Command and Special Command operations, they offer to provide hostage rescue planning and intelligence support to the Israelis. So yeah, what they can confirm is that nope, they're not contemplating U.S. boots on the ground involved in that mission. Instead, they're committed to sending experts from our government to the region to consult and advise with their Israeli counterparts to make sure that they find the best ways to go about getting these people home. So at least they're not doing nothing. U.S. officials have provided very few details about the number of Americans being held or their location and conditions, but have acknowledged that they believe that the number of hostages to be less than a handful. Now, I don't know how big that hand is, but there you go. An interagency team of U.S. officials from the State Department, National Security Council, and the FBI is receiving input from all over about the Americans who are missing and deceased in Israel, according to officials. Family members and friends have reached out to the embassy about loved ones, and the team is compiling it all alongside work that the FBI has been doing. Now, they've also been working through phone calls that have been coming into the United States Embassy in Israel, the FBI, and the White House from friends and relatives of Americans being missing. Some of these phone calls have been based on eyewitness accounts of people being taken by Hamas. But one difficulty they say has been trying to verify secondhand accounts. It definitely makes me think people should be paying attention to what they're really saying between the lines. If you plan on traveling anywhere outside the US, you have to be very careful these days, as you may just end up finding yourself alone and stranded. People are definitely feeling that Biden isn't really making an effort to find these lost Americans. Make sure you guys are always updated, subscribe to the channel, and tap that notification bell. And if you want to support the work that we're doing here, please light up the like button. I totally appreciate that, you guys. Don't forget to check out the channel merch for some cool stuff as well. I really appreciate that. I mean, let's be real, guys. At this point, we gotta stick together. The state of our government right now would be laughable if it wasn't already terrifying. You know what I mean? So at this moment, the US does not know precisely how many Americans are being held hostage by the Hamas terror group, according to officials. 14 Americans remain missing in the wake of the weekend attacks, but sadly, many are just presumed dead or could eventually turn up safe. For all we know. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby also confirmed that the number of Americans killed in the attacks is now known to be 27. Now, like I mentioned earlier, they believe that only a handful of Americans are currently being held by Hamas. How many that means? Your guess is as good as mine. Now, what I was honestly surprised by is when Kirby mentioned how they obviously have a terrific information and intelligence sharing relationship with Israel, especially given the recent attacks and the unknown number of American hostages. I'm not really sure if I can believe that, but critics are saying that the Hamas attack is a sign of a new world order and an overall weaker US. Russia has started the largest war in Europe since World War II. China has become more aggressive toward Taiwan. India has embraced an extreme level of nationalism. Israel has formed the most extreme government in its history. And of course, Hamas brazenly attacked Israel, launching thousands of missiles and publicly kidnapping and killing civilians. All of these developments are signs that the world may have fallen into a new period of disarray. Countries and political groups like Hamas are willing to take big risks rather than being afraid that the consequences would be too dire and simply bowing to the US and our allies. The simplest explanation is that the world is in the midst of a transition to a new order that experts describe with the word multipolar. So the United States is no longer that dominant power that it once was, and no replacement has really emerged either. As a result, political leaders in many places feel that it's time to assert their own interests and believe that the benefits of aggressive action may outweigh the costs. These leaders believe that they have more sway over their own region than the United States does. Now, unfortunately, we've been warning people that a funny multipolar world has been emerging and that they're just now realizing that this multipolarity involves quite a bit of chaos. Now, one expert went as far as to say that this old order is disintegrating. They said that countries are brimming with ambition, like tigers eyeing their prey, keen to find every opportunity among the ruins of the old order. This is all in the face of a weaker US. And you could definitely feel it, guys. American power has been on the decline, and there's very few reasons for it. For starters, it's honestly just natural for dominant countries to lose some of their influence over time. But it doesn't mean that the US, i.e. our government, doesn't have its share of the blame, especially with some strategic mistakes that are accelerating the arrival of a multipolar world. One of those mistakes was the assumption made by presidents from both parties that a wealthier China would ultimately automatically become a friendlier partner. But they failed to realize that the US was unintentionally building up a potential rival through lenient trade policies. Additionally, the US got itself caught up in a very expensive collection of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq during the early 21st century. The Iraq War in particular, it was damaging because it was an unprovoked conflict initiated by George W. Bush, GW. Then there's the recent humiliating retreat from Afghanistan under President Joe Biden's watch that further weakened the perception of American strength. Perhaps one of the biggest, most damaging things to American prestige has come from President or former President Donald Trump, who has rejected the very idea that the US should lead the world. Trump pulled out of international agreements and showed disregard for successful alliances like NATO. He also hinted that if he were to return to the presidency in 2025, he might abandon support for Ukraine. Now, in the case of Israel, Trump encouraged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to prioritize Israeli interests over those of the Palestinians. Hamas initiated the recent conflict, possibly with support from Iran, a longtime backer of the militant group. But critics do argue that Netanyahu's hardline approach contributed to the tension between Israel and Palestinian groups like Hamas. They say that the prime minister, who has prided himself on the vast political experience and irreplaceable wisdom of security matters, completely failed to identify the dangers that he was consciously leading Israel into when establishing a government of annexation and disposition. But despite these challenges, let's not forget the US remains one of the most powerful nations globally, with a unique ability to form alliances and broker peace. So for instance, the Trump administration brokered the Abraham Accords, historic diplomatic agreements between Israel and 4 other countries in the Middle East. The Biden administration also making progress toward even more ambitious deals involving Israel and Saudi Arabia. Such a big deal that experts are saying that Hamas's recent attack on Israel are actually an attempt to derail an Israeli-Saudi deal, which could isolate Iran, Hamas's supporter, and potentially lead to increased financial support for the more moderate Palestinian Authority. But if Israel's response to the attacks leads to widespread disruption in the Gaza Strip, it may complicate any potential treaty with Saudi Arabia and ultimately undermine the progress for the Abraham Accords. So if you think about it, we can definitely see Hamas's attacks as an effort to hinder the resurgence of American power and instead push the world further towards a multipolar landscape. So far, Biden has ordered U.S. military aircraft to Israel loaded with additional weapons, equipment, and supplies, and a U.S. carrier strike group armed with guided missiles. It's loitering in the eastern Mediterranean to hopefully deter other Iranian-backed militants based in Syria and Lebanon from taking advantage of the moment to step up their own attacks. The U.S. Navy strike group, led by USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest, most sophisticated carrier in the U.S. fleet, is manned by more than 5,000 sailors and Marines and places additional U.S. Special Forces, intelligence collection equipment, and attack planes closer to Gaza. These could be used in potential hostage rescue operations if the U.S. can learn more about their fate. Something that we're definitely keeping an eye on for sure, so don't miss these next updates, you guys.